Elias ruled the London Underground with an iron fist, but one look at Clara changed everything. From the shadows of his limousine, he watched as she struggled to fix a torn strap on her modest dress, her skin glowing under the flickering streetlights. She was a humble stranger in a dangerous world, yet he could not turn his eyes away from her quiet beauty and her desperate fumbling. In that one moment, the most feared man in the city became obsessed with a woman who did not even know he existed. His hunt had begun. The weight of the city always felt heavier in November. In the year 1995, London was a sprawling labyrinth of smoke, iron, and secrets, and Arthur was the man who held the keys to most of its locked doors. From the back of his charcoal sedan, he watched the world through glass that was thick enough to stop a bullet, but clear enough to reveal the decay of the East End. The rain was a relentless, fine mist that turned the cobblestones into slick ribbons of black, reflecting the dim amber glow of the street lamps. Arthur was a man carved from the very stone of the docks he commanded. At 34, he had the weary eyes of a man who had seen 3 lifetimes of violence and trade. His suit was bespoke, a deep navy wool that cost more than the average docker earned in a year, and his hands, though currently resting idly on his knees, bore the faint, faded scars of a youth spent fighting for every inch of territory. He was the unspoken king of the shipping industry, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and terror in the pubs along the Thames. He didn't seek trouble, but he was the master of ending it. "Traffic is stalled, Arthur," the driver remarked, his voice low and steady. "There is a collision at the junction ahead. It will be several minutes." Arthur didn't respond. He didn't mind the silence. In his world, silence was a luxury, a brief reprieve from the endless demands of captains, union leaders, and the men who worked the night shifts. He leaned his head back against the leather upholstery, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the muffled sound of the rain soothe the constant thrum of adrenaline that lived beneath his skin. Then he saw her. He opened his eyes as the car crawled forward a few feet and stopped again, directly adjacent to a dilapidated bus stop. Standing beneath the rusted corrugated metal roof was a young woman. She was alone, huddled against the biting wind that whipped off the river. She wore a floral dress, something light and entirely too thin for the autumn chill, and a simple cardigan that was soaked through. Arthur found himself leaning forward, his brow furrowing. There was something about the way she stood, shoulders hunched, head down, that radiated a quiet, stubborn resilience. But it was what she was doing that caught his breath. The hem of her dress had caught on the jagged edge of the metal bench, a long, cruel tear ripping through the delicate fabric. With trembling, pale fingers, she was trying to pin the cloth back together. Her hands were small, her skin flushed a deep pink from the cold, and as she fumbled with a tiny safety pin, she bit her lower lip in a display of intense concentration. Arthur couldn't look away. He had spent his life surrounded by women who wore diamonds like armor and silk like a weapon. He had known the touch of those who wanted his power or his money, women who moved with a calculated grace designed to be noticed. This woman, however, was entirely unaware of the world. She was engaged in a private, humble battle against the elements and a ruined garment. A strand of dark, wet hair escaped her modest bun, clinging to the curve of her neck. Arthur watched the way her breath came in small white puffs of steam. He felt a sudden, inexplicable jolt in his chest, a sharp, electric pull that defied logic. He was a man of iron and silence, yet the sight of her struggling with a simple pin made him feel more alive than he had in a decade. He watched the way her fingers brushed against her own thigh as she tried to align the edges of the tear. The movement was innocent, yet it felt profoundly intimate to him, a silent observer in the shadows of his expensive cage. He could see the goosebumps on her arms, the way her body shivered, yet she didn't give up. She pinned the dress with a final, shaky movement, then smoothed the fabric over her hip, with a sigh of relief that he could almost hear through the glass. In that moment, she looked up. Her eyes were wide, a soft, startling grey that seemed to hold all the mist of the London morning. She didn't see him, the tint on his windows ensured that, but she looked directly toward the car. For 3 seconds, Arthur felt as though she were looking straight into his soul, past the layers of gold and blood, seeing the man he had been before the city had hardened him. "Drive," Arthur commanded, his voice raspy. "Sir?" the driver asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. "I said drive. Find a way around the junction now." The car lurched forward, tires splashing through a puddle, sending a spray of muddy water toward the curb. Arthur turned his head, watching her through the rear window until she was nothing more than a small floral speck in the grey expanse of the East End. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached up, loosening his silk tie, feeling as though the air in the sedan had suddenly become too thick to breathe. He had everything a man could want: wealth, influence, a city that bowed to his whim. But as he sat in the darkness, the image of the woman at the bus stop burned in his mind. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she lived or where she was going. All he knew was the way her fingers had moved, the way she had fought to remain dignified in the face of a cold, indifferent world. She was a sparrow in a storm, and for the first time in his life, Arthur felt the heavy, undeniable weight of a protective instinct that had no place in his business. He thought of his sister, Clara, and the upcoming dinner party she was insisting he attend. He thought of the rivals who were currently trying to undercut his prices at the northern docks. Usually, these thoughts occupied his every waking hour, but now they felt like distant echoes. "Julian," Arthur said, addressing his driver by name for the first time that morning. "Yes, Arthur? I want you to find out who works the morning shifts at the garment shops near the East India docks, specifically anyone who might be wearing a floral dress with a tear in the hem." Julian hesitated, his eyes meeting Arthur's in the mirror. He had worked for the man for 10 years and had never heard such a request. Arthur was not a man of whims. He was a man of cold, hard facts. "Is there a security concern, sir?" Julian asked cautiously. Arthur leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he watched the rain continue to fall against the glass. The intensity of his gaze was enough to make most men flinch. "No," Arthur whispered, more to himself than to his driver. "There is no concern. Just find her. I need to know why I can't stop thinking about a torn dress and a girl who refused to let the rain win." As the sedan sped toward the heart of the city, leaving the docks behind, Arthur felt the first stirrings of a shift in his world. He had spent years building a fortress around his heart, ensuring that no one could get close enough to hurt him or influence him. But a single chance encounter in the damp November air had cracked the foundation. He didn't realize it yet, but the girl at the bus stop was more than just a fleeting image. She was the catalyst for a war that would soon consume him, a war not fought with guns and ledgers, but with the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of a man who had finally found something worth more than his empire. The car pulled into the private courtyard of his estate, the iron gates swinging shut behind them with a heavy final thud. Arthur stepped out, the cold air biting at his face, and for a moment he stood still, looking back toward the east. He could still see her eyes, those soft grey windows into a world he had long forgotten. He walked into his house, the marble floors echoing his footsteps, but the silence of the manor felt different now. It felt empty. He went to his study, pouring himself a glass of amber scotch, and stared at the map of the London docks pinned to the wall. His fingers traced the area where the bus stop stood. He would find her. He would find her because the memory of her touch on that torn fabric was a ghost he couldn't exorcise. And as the night began to settle over Britain, Arthur knew that his life of calculated power was about to collide with a force he couldn't control. The hunt had begun, but not for an enemy. It was a hunt for a shadow, a girl named Elena who had no idea that the most dangerous man in London was currently memorizing the way she bit her lip in the rain. Tomorrow, he would begin his search. Tomorrow he would step out of the shadows and into the light of a world she inhabited, a world where beauty was found in the fixing of things rather than the breaking of them. And as he took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, he knew that once he found her, he would never let her go back to the cold. The first thread of their lives had been woven together in the damp grey of 1995, and Arthur was a man who knew exactly how to pull a thread until the whole cloth belonged to him. He set the glass down, his mind already formulating the plan that would lead him to the doors of a humble tailor shop in the heart of Mayfair. The transition from the salt-sprayed, grit-stained docks of the East End to the hushed, velvet-lined corridors of Mayfair was a journey Arthur had made many times, yet it never felt quite so purposeful as it did on that Tuesday morning in late November 1995. The rain had slowed to a miserable hanging mist that clung to the wool of his overcoat like a shroud. He sat in the back of his sedan, his large, scarred hands resting heavily on his knees. It had taken his men less than 24 hours to find her. The description of a young woman in a torn floral dress, shivering at a bus stop near the docks, had been enough. Her name was Elena. Arthur stepped out of the car, the door held open by a silent man who knew better than to ask why the king of the shipping yards was standing in front of a boutique tailor shop instead of attending the meeting at the warehouse. Arthur adjusted his tie, his eyes fixed on the gold leaf lettering on the window. Inside, the world was different, orderly, quiet, and smelling of cedar and expensive steam. When he pushed the door open, a small bell chimed, a sound far too delicate for a man of his stature. An older man, dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit with a tape measure draped like a snake around his neck, hurried forward. "Sir, welcome. Do you have an appointment?" the man asked, his eyes scanning Arthur's expensive but rugged frame, sensing the coiled violence beneath the tailored surface. "I don't," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the glass display cases. "But I require a new suit, something bespoke, something exceptional." "Of course, sir. I am the master tailor here. I can certainly—" "I want the apprentice," Arthur interrupted, his gaze shifting toward the back of the shop, where a curtain of heavy green velvet partially obscured a workroom. "The young woman. I saw her work recently. I was impressed." The master tailor hesitated, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Eleanor? She is quite talented, sir, but she is still in training. For a man of your requirements, perhaps I should—" "Elena," Arthur repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. A moment later, the curtain parted. Elena stepped out, and for a heartbeat, the air in the room seemed to vanish. She was no longer the drenched, desperate girl from the bus stop. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat, sensible bun, and she wore a simple white blouse tucked into a high-waisted black skirt. But as she looked up and met Arthur's gaze, he saw the recognition flare in her hazel eyes. She remembered the charcoal sedan. She remembered the man who had watched her from the shadows while she struggled with her pride and her torn hem. "Mr. Arthur," the master tailor said, gesturing to him, though he did not know Arthur's status, only his presence. "This gentleman has requested you for his measurements." Elena's face went pale, then a soft, dusty rose crept up her neck. She didn't speak. She simply nodded and gathered her tools, a yellow measuring tape, a notepad, and a small stick of white chalk. She gestured toward the raised wooden platform in front of a triptych of floor-to-ceiling mirrors. Arthur stepped onto the platform, feeling like a wolf standing on an altar. He shed his overcoat, handing it to the master tailor, and stood in his shirt sleeves. He was a broad man, his shoulders thick from years of manual labor before he had ascended to his throne of iron, and his chest was a wall of solid muscle. Elena approached him tentatively. As she stepped into his personal space, the scent of her reached him, not the expensive perfumes of the women who usually flocked to his side, but something clean, like soap and sun-dried linen. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of silk. "Arms out." Arthur obeyed, watching her in the mirror. Her hands were small, her fingers tipped with tiny calluses from thousands of needle pricks. As she looped the tape measure around his chest, her knuckles brushed against his ribs. The contact was brief, but it felt like a jolt of electricity through his skin. He felt his muscles tighten instinctively. "You're very tense, sir," she murmured, her eyes focused on the numbers on the tape. "I need you to breathe normally." "I'm breathing just fine, Elena," he said. She froze at the sound of her name. She hadn't told him her name. She looked up, her face inches from his. Up close, he could see the faint sprinkle of freckles across the bridge of her nose and the way her lower lip trembled almost imperceptibly. "How do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I make it my business to know the things that interest me," Arthur replied, his voice dropping to a predatory silkiness. She looked away quickly, her hands moving to his waist. He could feel the heat radiating from her body. She knelt down to measure the inseam of his trousers, her movements professional yet charged with an agonizing intimacy. Arthur looked down at the top of her head, seeing the fine stray hairs that had escaped her bun. He felt a sudden, violent urge to reach out and touch her, not to harm, but to possess, to shield her from the very world he ruled. He saw her hands tremble as she marked the chalk against the dark fabric of his trousers. She was afraid of him, and rightfully so, but there was something else in her eyes, a curiosity, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished by his shadow. "You have a steady hand," he remarked, his gaze tracking the way she bit her lip in concentration. "Despite the shaking." Eleanor stood up, smoothing her skirt. She was breathless, her chest heaving slightly under the white cotton of her blouse. "It's a difficult task, sir, measuring a man who doesn't want to be measured." "Oh, I want this, Elena," Arthur said, stepping off the platform. He was much taller than her, forcing her to look up, her neck arched. "I want to see what you can create when you have the best materials at your disposal." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, laying it on the cutting table nearby. The master tailor's eyes widened at the sheer volume of the currency inside. "This is for the suit," Arthur said, though they both knew it was far more than any suit was worth, "and for the apprentice's time. I want her to handle every fitting. No one else touches the fabric." Eleanor looked at the money, then back at Arthur. "I'm just an apprentice. I don't own this shop." "You will be the one who makes this," Arthur stated, his voice a command. He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over her entirely. "I saw you the other night, Elena, in the rain, trying to hold yourself together with a few pins and a bit of hope." Her breath hitched. The memory of her vulnerability seemed to bruise her all over again. "I don't want to see you pinning anything ever again," he whispered. "You deserve better than rusted benches and floral rags." He turned to leave, his presence lingering in the small shop long after the bell had chimed his exit. Eleanor stood frozen, the yellow tape measure still clutched in her hand like a lifeline. She looked at the green velvet curtain, then at the heavy envelope of money on the table. She felt as though she had been marked, not with chalk, but with something far more permanent. Outside, Arthur climbed into the sedan. He looked at his reflection in the window, his face hard and unyielding. He had set the wheels in motion. He didn't just want a suit. He wanted to pull her into his world, to see if her light could survive his darkness. As the car pulled away from the curb, Arthur picked up a heavy, cream-colored invitation from the seat beside him. It was for his sister Clara's upcoming dinner party, a lavish, hollow affair for the elite of London's underbelly and the high society that pretended they didn't exist. He tapped the edge of the card against his chin, a slow, calculated smile spreading across his lips. He knew exactly how to ensure Elena would be there, not as a guest, but as something he could keep his eyes on. "Julian," Arthur said to his driver without looking up. "Yes, boss?" "Call my sister. Tell her we're going to need some extra help with the wardrobe for her guests next week. I know just the place to find it." The car disappeared into the London fog, leaving Elena behind in the quiet shop, unaware that the measure of her life was about to change forever. The estate belonging to Arthur and his sister Clara sat like a brooding stone titan on the outskirts of the city, shielded from the grit of the docks by iron gates and rows of ancient, skeletal oaks. It was late November in 1995, and the evening air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the impending chill of winter. Inside, however, the atmosphere was a stifling contrast of warmth, excessive light, and the clinking of crystal. Eleanor arrived at the service entrance, her small wooden sewing kit clutched tightly to her chest. She had been sent by the master tailor, who had received a personal and rather insistent request from Clara herself. The instructions were simple. A seamstress was needed on site for the duration of the gala, to handle any sartorial emergencies. Helena had spent the journey on the bus, trying to smooth the wrinkles out of her own modest navy dress, a garment she had sewn herself over 3 long nights. It was neat and respectable, but as she was ushered through the labyrinthine servant corridors, she felt like a common sparrow being led into a conservatory of peacocks. The house hummed with a restless energy. Waiters moved in synchronized patterns, carrying trays of champagne, while the distant swell of a live orchestra drifted through the vents. Elena was stationed in a small, elegant antechamber just off the main ballroom, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling mirrors and upholstered in pale cream silk. She didn't have to wait long for her first task. A woman named Beatrice, draped in shimmering silver sequins that looked more like armor than evening wear, burst into the room. She was fuming, a jagged tear visible at the hip where a stray piece of antique furniture had snagged her gown. "Fix it," Beatrice commanded, not even looking at Elena. "And be quick about it. I'm missing the opening toast." Elena dropped to her knees on the plush carpet, her fingers moving with a practiced rhythmic grace. She chose a silver thread that matched the sequins perfectly, her needle darting in and out of the expensive fabric. As she worked, she could hear the muffled roar of the party next door, the laughter of men who sounded as though they owned the world, and the high-pitched trills of women who knew they were the world's most precious ornaments. Just as Elena was knotting the final stitch, the heavy oak door to the antechamber creaked open. She didn't look up immediately, assuming it was another guest in need of repair. "You're finished, madam," Elena whispered, smoothing the fabric one last time. Beatrice didn't even offer a thank you. She simply swept out of the room, her silver train hissing against the floor. Eleanor stayed on the floor for a moment, gathering her pins, her head bowed. Then, the air in the room changed. The temperature seemed to rise, and a heavy, masculine scent, leather, expensive tobacco, and something like the sharp ozone before a storm, filled the small space. "You have a very steady hand, Elena." The voice was low, vibrating with a gravelly richness that sent a shiver racing down her spine. She looked up and found Arthur standing in the doorway. He had discarded his overcoat, appearing now in a black tuxedo that fit his broad frame with lethal precision. The white silk of his shirt contrasted sharply with his tanned, rugged features. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes, those dark, piercing eyes she had seen through the window of a sedan in the rain, were locked onto hers with a terrifying intensity. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Mr. Arthur, I didn't know you were there." "This is my home," he said softly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded like a gavel. "I know where every shadow falls within these walls." He walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator who had no reason to hurry, because he knew his prey had nowhere to go. Elena backed away until the backs of her calves hit the edge of a velvet chaise longue. Arthur didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Clara told me she requested the best," Arthur murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. "I see she was right." "I'm just doing my job," Elena replied, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain professional. "I should get back to my kit. There might be others." "Let them wait," Arthur said. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, before his fingers finally made contact with the sleeve of her dress. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it felt electric. His thumb brushed against the fabric of her shoulder, tracing the line where the sleeve met the bodice. Eleanor held her breath. The physical contact was intimate, far beyond what was appropriate for a man of his standing and a woman of hers, yet she found she couldn't pull away. There was a magnetism in him, a gravity that pulled at her very soul. "This dress," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You made this, didn't you?" Eleanor nodded wordlessly. "It's honest," Arthur said, his fingers sliding down her arm to her wrist, where he gently took her hand in his. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm but surprisingly gentle. He turned her hand over, looking at the small pinpricks on her fingertips, the marks of her trade. "There is so much deception in the room next door. Silk and diamonds hiding rot and greed. But you are the only real thing in this entire house tonight." He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. Eleanor could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight scar on his chin, and the sheer, unadulterated focus in his gaze. She felt a surge of something she couldn't name, a mixture of fear, longing, and a strange, dizzying sense of importance. To a man like Arthur, who commanded fleets of ships and legions of men, she was a nobody. Yet in this moment, he was looking at her as if she were the center of the universe. "You don't belong in the hallways, Elena," he whispered, his breath warm against her cheek. "You belong where people can see you, where I can see you." He lifted her hand and pressed a lingering kiss to the center of her palm. The sensation sent a jolt through her entire body. Before she could find her voice, the door swung open again. Clara stood there, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with a calculated coldness. She was dressed in deep violet, her hair pinned up in an intricate web of braids and pearls. She didn't look surprised, she looked annoyed. "Arthur," Clara said, her voice like a whip, "the commissioner is asking for you. It's time for the toast." Arthur didn't let go of Elena's hand immediately. He held it for one more heartbeat, a silent communication passing between them, before he slowly released her. He straightened his jacket, the mask of the cold, untouchable king of the docks sliding back into place. "Duty calls," Arthur said, his voice now devoid of the warmth it had held moments ago. He looked at Clara, then back at Elena. "Make sure she has everything she needs, sister. Everything." As Arthur strode out of the room, Clara stepped inside, the silk of her skirts rustling like a warning. She didn't look at the sewing kit or the torn dresses. She looked directly at Elena, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the young woman who had managed to capture her brother's impossible attention. "My brother is a man of many appetites, Elena," Clara said, her tone deceptively sweet. "But he is also a man who possesses what he desires. You would do well to remember that a sparrow shouldn't fly too close to a hawk, no matter how golden the sun looks." Clara turned and followed her brother, leaving Elena alone in the quiet antechamber. Eleanor sank onto the chaise longue, her hand still tingling where Arthur's lips had touched it. She looked at her reflection in the tall mirrors, seeing a girl she barely recognized, a girl whose life had just been irrevocably altered by a single gaze and a whispered promise. Outside, the music swelled to a crescendo, but through the thin walls Elena heard something else, the heavy, rhythmic thud of the front doors opening, and the arrival of a guest who hadn't been invited, but whose presence would soon cast a shadow over everything Arthur built. The biting winds of late December in 1995 swept across the Thames, carrying the scent of salt, rust, and the heavy burden of secrets. Arthur stood at the edge of the pier, his long wool coat fastened tight against the chill. Behind him, the rhythmic clanging of metal shipping containers being hoisted by massive cranes provided a mechanical heartbeat to his empire. To anyone else, the docks were a place of industry. To Arthur, they were a fortress of leverage. Julian, his oldest confidant, and the only man brave enough to speak unfiltered truth to him, stood several paces back. He had been watching Arthur's silhouette for nearly 20 minutes, noting the way his leader's gaze drifted toward the city lights rather than the cargo manifests. "The men are talking, Arthur," Julian said, his voice cutting through the gale. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "They see you lingering in Mayfair. They see the charcoal sedan parked outside a tailor shop for hours. Weakness is a scent, and right now, you're wearing it like a cheap cologne." Arthur didn't turn around. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. "I am not lingering, Julian, I am observing." "You're obsessed," Julian countered, his tone dropping to a low, urgent hiss. Silas and the others, they don't see a man observing a craft. They see a man distracted by a girl who doesn't know the difference between a tax bracket and a death warrant. If they think your heart has found a soft spot, they will drive a blade through it just to see you bleed. Arthur finally turned, his eyes cold and dark as the river water. "Let them try. I have spent 15 years building a wall around this city. One woman doesn't dismantle a fortress, Julian. She simply reminds me why I built it in the first place." But even as he spoke the words, Arthur knew the lie lived in his marrow. Elena wasn't just a woman, she was a glitch in his calculated existence. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the way she had looked in the rain, her fingers trembling over a torn seam. It was a vulnerability so pure, it made his own strength feel hollow. The conversation was interrupted by a courier, a young man who looked as though he had run through every back alley in East London. He handed a small crumpled note to Julian, who read it and then looked at Arthur with a grimace. "It's about the brother. Marcus," Julian said. "He's been playing cards in the back of the betting shops again. He owes 5,000 to Miller's crew. They've picked him up. They're planning to break his hands by midnight to send a message to anyone who thinks credit is a suggestion." Arthur felt a flare of white-hot protectiveness that had nothing to do with business. Marcus was Elena's only family, her anchor. If Marcus was broken, Elena's world would shatter, and the light he had been watching from the shadows would go out forever. "Take me there," Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Arthur, let the enforcers handle it, Julian pleaded. If you go yourself for a petty gambler, it confirms everything the rivals are whispering. I said, take me there. The basement of the betting shop was a cavern of damp concrete and the smell of stale tobacco. Marcus was tied to a wooden chair, his face bruised and his breath coming in ragged gasps. Miller, a man with a jagged scar running from his ear to his chin, held a heavy iron pipe testing its weight. When the heavy steel door creaked open and Arthur stepped into the dim light, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The three thugs in the room froze. They knew the face of the man who controlled the flow of every ship entering the harbor. Arthur didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply walked to the center of the room, his presence expanding until the walls seemed to shrink. He looked at Marcus, pale, terrified, and so much like Elena in the eyes, and then turned his gaze to Miller. Put the pipe down, Arthur said softly. He owes us, Arthur, Miller stammered, his bravado evaporating. Rules are rules. He's 3 weeks late. Arthur stepped into Miller's personal space, so close he could see the sweat beading on the man's forehead. He reached out and adjusted the lapel of Miller's jacket with terrifyingly slow, precise movements. His debts are now my debts, and I don't pay with paper. I pay with the privilege of you continuing to operate in this district. If you touch a single hair on his head, or if you even speak his name again, I will ensure that your name is scrubbed from every record in this city. Do you understand? Miller nodded frantically, his throat working in a dry swallow. Arthur turned to the men holding Marcus. Untie him. Send him home. Tell him he's had a lucky night. Arthur watched as Marcus was practically shoved out the door, the young man stumbling into the night, confused and shivering. Arthur didn't follow him. He didn't want Marcus to know who had saved him. Not yet. He wanted to be the shadow that kept the world at bay, not the monster that brought the war home. But secrets in London have a way of leaking through the cracks. 2 nights later, Arthur was sitting in his private club, the Gilded Rose. The room was a sanctuary of dark mahogany, velvet curtains and the faint clink of crystal. He was nursing a glass of scotch, watching the amber liquid swirl, when the heavy oak doors at the entrance swung open with a force that silenced the room. Elena stood there. She looked out of place in her simple wool coat and a scarf that had seen better winters. Her hair was windswept and her cheeks were flushed from the cold. She didn't look at the opulence or the wealthy men staring at her in confusion. Her eyes were locked on Arthur, sitting in his corner booth like a king on a throne. She marched toward him, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor. Arthur stood up as she approached, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that no rival's threat ever could. You, she breathed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and something that looked dangerously like tears. My brother came home 2 nights ago. He was terrified, but he said the debt was gone. He said a man like a ghost, walked in and made the world stop. Arthur remained silent, his gaze fixed on her. Why? She demanded, stepping closer. She was now within arm's reach, and the scent of her, rainwater and lily of the valley, hit him like a physical blow. Why are you following me? Why are you involving yourself in my life? My brother is a fool, but he's my fool. I didn't ask for your charity. It wasn't charity, Elena, Arthur said, his voice smooth and deep. He took a single step toward her, closing the gap until he could feel the radiant heat of her body. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric of her coat, wanting to feel the person beneath it. It was an investment in peace. You shouldn't have to carry the weight of a brother's mistakes. I don't belong to you, she whispered, though she didn't pull away. Her eyes searched his, finding the hardness there but also the strange, terrifying hunger. You think because you have money and power that you can just fix things. But you're dangerous, Arthur. I can see it in the way people look at you. I can see it in your hands. Arthur reached out and gently took her hand in his. His skin was warm, his grip firm but surprisingly tender. He traced the lines of her palm with his thumb, a gesture that was both a caress and a claim. Elena's breath hitched, her fingers curling instinctively against his. I am a man of many sins, Elena, he whispered, leaning down so his lips were inches from her ear. But my greatest sin is that I cannot stop looking at you. I saw you in the rain, and the world hasn't been the same since. You can hate me for it, but I will not let the world hurt you." The tension in the room was electric, a bridge between two worlds that should never have met. Eleanor looked up at him, her fear warring with a sudden, overwhelming spark of attraction that made her lightheaded. She realized then that Arthur wasn't just a benefactor. He was a storm, and she was already caught in the eye of it. Before she could speak, the club's heavy doors opened again and Julian appeared, his expression tight with alarm. He caught Arthur's eye and gave a subtle, sharp nod toward the street. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice carrying a warning that even Elena could understand. "We have a problem at the West Warehouse. Someone just sent a message and it's burning." Arthur's hand tightened on Elena's for a fraction of a second before he let go. The softness in his eyes vanished, replaced by the cold, lethal steel of the man who ruled the docks. He looked at her one last time, a silent promise hanging between them, before he turned to face the fire that was coming for them both. As he walked away, Eleanor stood alone in the center of the gilded room, the ghost of his touch still searing her skin, unaware that the message burning at the docks had her name written on the embers. The fog of late December in 1995 didn't just roll into London, it claimed it, swallowing the jagged edges of the docklands and turning the street lamps into blurry amber orbs. Elena pulled her thin wool coat tighter around her chest, the fabric doing little to repel the damp chill that seemed to seep directly into her marrow. It was a Tuesday, a day that felt like a bridge to nowhere, and her shift at the tailor shop in Mayfair had left her fingers stiff and her mind clouded with images of silk thread and silver needles. She walked with her head down, her boots clicking a frantic rhythm against the uneven pavement of the East End. Since the night her brother Marcus had come home shaking with a strange, terrified relief, claiming his debts had been wiped clean by a silent benefactor, Eleanor had lived in a state of perpetual vibration. She knew who that benefactor was. She could still feel the weight of Arthur's gaze from the week before, a look so heavy it felt like a physical touch. The street she lived on was narrow, lined with brick terrace houses that looked like tired old men huddling together for warmth. Just as she passed the mouth of a darkened alleyway, a shadow detached itself from the soot-stained wall. Eleanor gasped, her heart leaping into her throat, but she didn't scream. She knew the silhouette, the broad shoulders, the long, structured coat that cost more than her family earned in a year, and the stillness, the absolute, terrifying stillness of a man who ruled by silence. "You're late tonight, Eleanor," Arthur said. His voice was a low hum, vibrating through the cold air like the engine of an idling car. "The head tailor had a rush order for a gala," she replied, her own voice sounding thin and breathless. She didn't stop walking, but her pace slowed instinctively. To her surprise, he stepped in beside her, matching her stride with a predatory grace. He didn't offer a greeting, nor did he explain why the most powerful man in the shipping districts was haunting a residential street in the dead of winter. He simply walked. The presence of him was overwhelming. He smelled of cold rain, expensive tobacco, and a faint, masculine scent of cedar wood. For several minutes, the only sound between them was the synchronized rhythm of their footsteps. As they passed under a flickering lamp, Elena risked a glance at him. His profile was carved from granite, his jaw tight and clean-shaven despite the late hour. There was a scar thin as a whisper, trailing from his temple to his cheekbone, a map of a life she couldn't begin to fathom. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability. She was a woman who spent her days mending the finery of the elite, and he was the man who likely decided which ships entered the harbor and which ones stayed lost at sea. "Marcus told me what happened," she said softly, her breath blooming in a white cloud before her. "With the money. With the men who were looking for him." Arthur didn't look at her. "Your brother is a fool, but he is your brother. Fools often need a shadow to hide in." "I can't pay you back, Arthur," she whispered, her voice catching on his name. It was the first time she had spoken it aloud to his face, and the word felt heavy like a secret shared in a confessional. "I didn't ask for payment," he replied. They reached the small iron gate of her tenement. The wood of her front door was peeling, a stark contrast to the polished charcoal sedan she knew was likely idling just a few blocks away, waiting for its king. Arthur turned to face her, his massive frame blocking out the rest of the world. He stepped into her personal space, invading the small bubble of warmth she had tried to maintain. Eleanor felt her back hit the cold brick of the entry, her breath hitching in her chest. He was so close she could feel the radiant heat coming off his body, a furnace against the December frost. He didn't touch her at first. He simply looked at her, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel as though she were being read like a book. Then slowly he reached out. His gloved hand, encased in soft black leather, rose to her face. He used 2 fingers to tilt her chin upward, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You were trying to fix your dress," he murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly register. "That first night in the rain. I watched you struggle with a pin for 3 minutes. You didn't give up. You didn't cry. You just kept trying to put yourself back together." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. I had to. I couldn't go home with a ruined dress. My mother would have worried. "Most people would have let the world see them fall apart," Arthur said. He moved his hand, his thumb brushing over the line of her lower lip. The sensation of the leather against her skin was electric, a jarring mix of rough and smooth that sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "I don't like seeing things I value in disrepair. I'm not a thing, Arthur," she breathed, though her body was leaning toward him, drawn by a magnetic pull she couldn't resist. "No," he agreed, his eyes darkening. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek, smelling of peppermint and power. "You are the only thing in this city that doesn't have a price tag, and that makes you very dangerous to a man like me." He didn't kiss her, though the air between their lips was thick with the possibility of it. Instead, he leaned closer to her ear, his voice a ghost of a promise. "Listen to me, Elena. This city is full of teeth. It is full of men who would tear someone like you apart just to see the color of your spirit. But as long as I breathe, as long as I walk these docks, you will never walk alone in the dark again. Do you understand me?" It wasn't a question, it was a vow. It was the kind of protection that felt like a velvet noose, beautiful, expensive, and potentially suffocating. He pulled back, his hand lingering on her neck for a second longer than necessary, the heat of his palm seeping through the collar of her coat. "Go inside," he commanded softly. "Bolt the door. Dream of something other than silk and needles." Elena stood frozen as he turned and disappeared back into the fog. He didn't look back. She watched the mist swallow his form until the street was empty once more, leaving her alone with the thudding of her heart and the terrifying realization that her life was no longer her own. She was no longer just an apprentice or a sister or a daughter. She was the focal point of a storm, a quiet girl caught in the center of a man's obsession. As she turned the key in her lock, she noticed something caught in the gate, a small, white envelope. She snatched it up, her hands trembling. Inside was no note, no explanation. There was only a single exquisite scrap of emerald green silk, the most expensive fabric she had ever felt, and a heavy gold key that didn't belong to her house. She stepped into the dark hallway of her home, the smell of her mother's cabbage soup wafting from the kitchen. But her mind was miles away, locked in the sunroom of a manor she had never seen, wondering what door that gold key was meant to open. The silence of the house felt different now. It felt like a countdown. Tomorrow, she knew, the world would look different. The tailor shop would feel smaller, the streets of London narrower, and the shadow of Arthur would be waiting for her at every corner, weaving a web of gold and iron that she wasn't sure she wanted to escape. She clutched the emerald silk to her chest, the fabric a vibrant promise of a world she was about to enter, oblivious to the fact that across the city, a pair of eyes was watching her window from the back of a charcoal sedan, waiting for the light to go out. By the middle of January in 1996, the world outside the heavy oak doors of the manor felt like a distant, fading memory to Eleanor. London was a city of grey slush and biting winds, but inside Arthur's sanctuary, the air was perpetually warm and scented with cedarwood and expensive tobacco. He had transformed the sprawling sunroom at the back of the house into a studio that rivaled the finest ateliers in Mayfair. There were bolts of silk in shades of midnight blue and emerald, rolls of Italian wool so soft they felt like water, and a mahogany cutting table that gleamed under the winter sun. Arthur didn't demand she stay, but he made the alternative feel like a descent back into a cold, colorless vacuum. He had a way of providing that felt less like charity and more like an inevitable force of nature. Every morning, a fresh carafe of tea and a plate of delicate pastries appeared in the sunroom, and every afternoon, Arthur would find his way there. He didn't interrupt her. He simply existed in the same space, a silent, tethering presence that Elena found herself leaning toward even when she tried to pull away. She spent her days lost in the rhythm of her work. The rhythmic click of the needle and the whisper of fabric being sliced by silver shears were the only sounds that filled the room. She was no longer just an apprentice fixing torn hems for ungrateful socialites. She was creating. She was currently working on a dress of pale champagne-colored satin, draped so intricately that it looked like liquid moonlight. One particular afternoon, as the sun began to dip low, casting long amber shadows across the floor, Elena felt the familiar shift in the atmosphere. The heavy door clicked shut and the scent of Arthur's cologne, something dark, woody and dangerously masculine, filled her senses. She didn't look up from her stitching, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled the thread through the delicate fabric. "You've been working for 6 hours without a break, Eleanor," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. "The drape isn't right yet," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the mannequin. "It needs to catch the light differently. If I don't finish this fold now, I'll lose the vision." She heard his footsteps, slow, deliberate, the sound of a man who owned every inch of the earth he walked upon. He stopped just inches behind her. The heat radiating from his body was a physical weight, a magnetic pull that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. He reached out, his large hand hovering near her shoulder before he thought better of it. "You seek perfection in a world that is inherently broken," he remarked, his tone tinged with a strange, melancholy admiration. Helena finally turned to look at him. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and faint, jagged scars that hinted at a life she could barely imagine. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been a week ago, yet his gaze remained as sharp and piercing as a blade. "Is that why you brought me here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "To have something perfect to look at while everything else is what it is?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to a velvet armchair positioned near her sewing station and did something that caught her completely off guard. He sank to his knees on the Persian rug before her. It was a gesture of such profound vulnerability from a man of his stature that Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. He didn't look down. He looked up at her, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that felt like a brand. He reached out, his hand coming to rest on her knee. The touch was firm, the warmth of his palm seeping through the thin cotton of her simple work dress. It wasn't a move of aggression, but one of grounding. "I have spent my entire life building walls, Elena," he said, his voice dropping to a level of intimacy that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "I have fought for every scrap of power I hold. I have seen things, done things, that would make you want to run from this house and never look back. My world is one of iron, blood, and cold calculations." Elena's hand, still holding the needle, dropped to her lap. She felt the weight of his confession, the gravity of the man who ruled the shipping docks and controlled the heartbeat of the city's shadows. "Then why am I here, Arthur? Why me?" His thumb began to stroke the side of her knee, a slow, rhythmic movement that sent a spark of electricity straight to her core. "Because when I am in this room, when I watch you turn a piece of string and a bit of cloth into something beautiful, the noise stops. The voices of the men who want my head, the demands of the syndicates, the constant thrum of the next war. It all goes silent. You are the only peace I have ever known, Elena. You are the only thing in my life that isn't a transaction." The honesty in his voice was a physical blow. Eleanor reached out, her fingers tentatively brushing the dark hair at his temple. He closed his eyes at her touch, a low, ragged sigh escaping his lips. In that moment, he wasn't the king of the docks or the most feared man in East London. He was a man seeking sanctuary. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm afraid of what happens when the world outside catches up to this room. You can't keep me in a glass box forever, Arthur." He opened his eyes, and the vulnerability was gone. replaced by a fierce, terrifying protectiveness. He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. She could feel his warm breath on her skin, smelling faintly of expensive scotch and the winter air. "I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let the world touch you," he vowed. His hand moved from her knee to the small of her back, pulling her slightly forward until she was leaning over him. The tension between them was a living thing, thick and suffocating. "You think this is a cage? Perhaps it is. But it is the only place you will ever be safe, because out there they will try to use you to get to me. And I will not allow that. I cannot allow that." He stood up then, the transition from the kneeling suitor to the commanding leader happening in the blink of an eye. He didn't break eye contact as he straightened his shirt. He leaned down and pressed a lingering, soft kiss to her forehead, a gesture that felt more like a seal of ownership than a simple goodbye. "Finish the dress, Elena," he said softly. "I want to see you in it when the moon is high. We have guests arriving soon for a private dinner. It's time you met some of the people who keep the gears of this city turning." As he walked toward the door, he paused, his hand on the brass handle. He didn't turn back, but his shoulders were tense. "And Elena, if you hear raised voices in the hallway later tonight, do not come out. Some matters are better left in the dark." He vanished into the corridor, leaving Elena alone in the fading light. She looked down at the champagne satin, the fabric reflecting the last rays of the sun. It was beautiful, yes, but as she picked up her needle, she couldn't shake the feeling that the silk was starting to feel like cold, shimmering iron. The house was silent for a few moments, until the distant, heavy thud of the front door echoing through the marble foyer signaled an arrival. It wasn't the polite knock of a dinner guest. It was the hurried, frantic pace of someone bringing news that couldn't wait. Elena moved toward the window, peering out into the twilight where a black car sat idling in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The winter of 1995 had settled into the bones of London like a stubborn fever. Inside the prestigious tailor shop in Mayfair, the air was thick with the scent of expensive wool, cedarwood shavings, and the metallic tang of steam irons. Elena stood at her workbench, her fingers moving with a practiced rhythm as she basted the lining of a midnight blue dinner jacket. It was a peaceful world of silk and measurements, yet she felt the invisible weight of Arthur's shadow pressing against the glass storefront. Ever since the dinner party at the estate, her life had acquired a strange, shimmering duality. By day, she was the apprentice, the girl who pinned hems and fetched coffee. By night, she was the woman who occupied the thoughts of the most feared man on the docks. Arthur's protection was a tangible thing, manifesting in the sleek black cars that lingered at the corner of the street, and the way the shop owner, a man usually prone to fits of temper, now spoke to her with a hushed, almost reverent tone. It was mid-afternoon on a Tuesday when the illusion of safety shattered. The street outside was quiet, the sky a bruised purple as the sun began its early descent. Elena was alone in the front of the shop, adjusting a display mannequin, when the roar of a high-powered motorcycle tore through the silence. She barely had time to look up before a heavy object came hurtling through the air. The sound of the front window exploding was deafening, a jagged, crystalline scream that sprayed shards of glass across the polished floorboards. Elena dove for cover behind the heavy mahogany counter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. For a long minute, there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the distant retreating whine of the engine. When she finally dared to peer over the edge of the wood, her eyes fell on the culprit. A heavy brick lay amidst the ruin of the glass, and tied to it with a piece of dirty twine was a scrap of fabric, a torn, mud-stained piece of floral cotton that looked hauntingly like the dress she had been wearing the day she met Arthur. Pinned to the fabric was a note, the handwriting jagged and cruel. "Even the prettiest things can be torn apart." By the time Julian arrived with 4 of Arthur's men, Elena was shaking so violently she could barely hold the glass of water the shop owner had given her. Julian didn't speak. His face was a mask of cold efficiency as he directed the men to board up the window and sweep away the debris. He placed a hand on Elena's shoulder, his grip firm. "He's coming for you," Julian said softly. "The car is outside." The drive to the manor was a blur of wet pavement and orange street lamps. When the heavy iron gate swung open, Elena felt a wave of nausea. She knew this was a message meant for Arthur, a strike at his only visible weakness, and the thought that she was a liability in a war she didn't understand made her feel smaller than ever. She was waiting in the small library, the one with the fireplace that always smelled of peat, when she heard his footsteps. They weren't the steady, measured strides she was used to. They were heavy, echoing with a primal urgency. Arthur burst into the room, still wearing his heavy charcoal overcoat. He looked as though he had walked straight through a storm. He didn't say a word. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. The contact was jarring, the cold wool of his coat against her face, the scent of rain and something sharper, like copper. He held her with a desperate, crushing intensity, his large hands splaying across her back, as if checking to ensure she was still whole. "Did they touch you?" His voice was a low growl, vibrating against her ear. "No," she whispered, her hands clutching at his lapels. "It was just the glass. Arthur, what is happening?" He pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes, usually so controlled and piercing, were dark with a terrifying fractured light. He reached up, his thumb brushing a tiny microscopic scratch on her cheek she hadn't even felt. His touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to the violence she could sense boiling beneath his skin. "Silas," he spat the name like it was poison. "He thinks he can reach me through you. He thinks he can play games with what belongs to me." "I don't belong to anyone," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but defiant. Arthur's gaze didn't waver. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. The heat radiating from him was overwhelming, a physical force that made the air between them feel thin. "In this city, Elena, you are under my shadow. That makes you mine to protect. And anyone who forgets that will learn why I rule the docks." He turned away then, heading toward the decanter of scotch on the side table. As he poured a glass, the sleeve of his white shirt retreated, and Elena gasped. His knuckles were split and swollen, the skin broken and stained with dark, drying blood. There was a bruise forming along his jaw, a jagged purple mark that hadn't been there that morning. "You went to find them," she said, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "Arthur, look at you." She moved toward him, her instinct to heal overriding her fear. She took his hand in hers, her small fingers looking pale against his bruised, massive grip. He didn't pull away, but his body was as rigid as iron. She saw the coldness in his eyes, a flat, lethal void that chilled her blood. This wasn't the man who watched her sew with a quiet, longing gaze. This was the monster people whispered about in the pubs along the Thames. "This is the cost, Elena," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You wanted to know who I am. This is it. I am the man who breaks bones so that you can sit in a shop and sew silk. I am the man who keeps the wolves at the door by being the biggest wolf in the pack." He drained the scotch in one swallow and set the glass down with a heavy thud. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the coldness flickered, replaced by a raw, agonizing vulnerability. He reached out, his hand cupping her neck, pulling her toward him until their foreheads touched. "I can't let you go back there," he murmured. "Not yet. You'll stay here. I'll bring the materials you need. I'll buy the whole damn shop if I have to. But you aren't leaving my sight." "That's not protection, Arthur," she whispered, her heart breaking even as she leaned into his warmth. "That's a cage." "Then let it be a gilded one," he replied, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that tasted of salt and smoke. It was a kiss of possession, a claim staked in the middle of a battlefield. As he led her toward the stairs, his hand firm on the small of her back, Elena felt a deep, sinking dread. She was safe, yes, but the price of that safety was becoming clearer with every drop of blood on his knuckles. She followed him into the upper hall, but as they passed his private study, she caught a glimpse of the door standing slightly ajar. On the desk, illuminated by a single lamp, sat a stack of ledgers and a series of photographs she hadn't seen before. Among them was a picture of her brother, Marcus, standing outside a pub he frequented. Next to it was a document with her brother's name at the top, stamped with a seal she didn't recognize. Arthur continued walking, unaware that she had seen it. Elena's feet felt like lead as she realized that the man holding her hand might be keeping more than just the wolves away. He might be the one holding the leash to the very debt that had nearly destroyed her family. Her mind raced with the implications, and as she stepped into the bedroom he had prepared for her, the clicking of the lock behind them sounded less like security and more like a final closing door. The winter of 1996 arrived with a cruelty that even the thick stone walls of Arthur's manor could not entirely repel. Outside, the London sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of more sleet, but inside the study, the air was thick with the scent of aged mahogany and the lingering smoke of a single cigar. Elena sat at the small writing desk Arthur had gifted her, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship with inlaid mother-of-pearl. She was supposed to be sketching designs for a new silk waistcoat, but her mind kept drifting to the quiet peace that had settled over her family. Her brother Marcus was different lately. He was no longer looking over his shoulder or jumping at every knock on the door. He had told her that the men he owed money to, men with jagged scars and eyes like cold flint, had simply stopped calling. He believed they had grown tired of him, or perhaps found a more lucrative target. Elena, however, was not so naive. She knew that in the world of the London docks, debts did not simply evaporate. They were paid, or they were collected in blood. Arthur had been her protector, her silent shadow and her benefactor. He had given her silk when she had only known cotton, and safety when she had only known fear. But a small, nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered that Arthur never did anything without a calculation. When a heavy gust of wind rattled the window pane, Elena stood up to draw the velvet curtains. As she turned back, her hip brushed against the side of Arthur's massive executive desk. A drawer not quite latched slid open an inch. She knew she should close it. She knew the rules of this house. There were rooms she didn't enter and papers she didn't read. But the name Marcus was visible on the corner of a manila folder, written in a precise, authoritative hand. With a heart that hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, Eleanor pulled the drawer further. She lifted the folder. Inside were 3 pages of ledger entries. There were dates, amounts, and signatures. Her breath hitched. The debt Marcus had owed to the loan shark, £4,000 of high-interest misery, had been paid in full 2 months ago. But the ledger didn't end there. Beneath the payment confirmation was a new contract. It stated that the debt was now held by a holding company she recognized as one of Arthur's front businesses. The interest rate was 0, but the terms were absolute. Marcus was now legally and financially bound to Arthur. Every hour Marcus worked at the warehouse, every penny he earned was being tracked. Arthur hadn't saved Marcus, he had acquired him. "You shouldn't be in here, Eleanor." The voice was low, vibrating through the floorboards before it reached her ears. Eleanor gasped, the folder slipping from her fingers and scattering papers across the dark wood floor. Arthur stood in the doorway, his silhouette imposing against the dim light of the hallway. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the powerful muscles of his forearms. "You lied to me," Elena said, her voice trembling, but her eyes burning with a sudden, fierce light. "You told me it was handled. You told me he was safe." Arthur walked into the room, his movements slow and predatory, yet possessed of a strange, weary grace. He didn't look at the papers on the floor. He looked only at her. "He is safe. No one is going to break his legs, Elena. No one is going to threaten your mother's house because he couldn't keep his hands off the cards." "But he belongs to you now," she cried, stepping toward him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "He's just another piece of your empire. You didn't do it for me or for him. You did it so you could have one more string to pull if I ever tried to leave." Arthur reached her in 2 long strides. He didn't flinch at her anger. He seemed to absorb it. "In this city, Elena, everyone belongs to someone. I chose to make him mine so that he wouldn't be theirs. Would you rather I left him to the mercies of men like Silas, men who would have used him to get to you in ways you cannot even imagine? I would rather have had the truth." She shoved his chest, but it was like trying to move a mountain. "You treat people like silk and thread, Arthur. You think you can just weave us into whatever pattern you want. I'm not a project, and my brother isn't an asset." The air between them was electric, charged with a volatile mix of betrayal and an attraction that neither of them could suppress. Arthur reached out, his large hands catching her by the waist. The contact was sudden and firm, pulling her flush against the heat of his body. Elena gasped, her hands landing on his shoulders to push him away, but her fingers instinctively curled into the fabric of his shirt. "You are the only thing in my life that isn't an asset," Arthur whispered, his voice dropping to a gravelly intimacy that made her knees weak. He leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers. "I protect what is mine. I don't apologize for the methods. I saw a hole in your life that made you vulnerable, and I plugged it with the only thing this city understands: power." "It's ownership," she breathed, her anger warring with the intoxicating scent of him, sandalwood, iron, and the cold winter air. "Call it what you want," he murmured. His thumb brushed the sensitive skin just above her hip, sending a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity through her. "But look me in the eye and tell me you'd rather he be back in that gutter." Eleanor looked up, searching his face. His eyes were dark, swirling with a possessiveness that should have terrified her, but instead it ignited a different kind of fire. She hated that he was right about the danger, and she hated even more how much she wanted to believe his justifications. His grip tightened, his fingers splaying across the small of her back, pulling her so close she could feel the steady, heavy thud of his heart. The tension in the room shifted from an argument to something much more primal. For a moment, the world outside, the docks, the debts, the shadows of East London disappeared. There was only the friction of his shirt against her palms and the way his gaze never left hers, as if he were trying to memorize every flicker of emotion in her soul. "I won't be a bird in a gilded cage, Arthur," she whispered, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Then fly," he challenged, his lips mere inches from hers. "The door isn't locked, Elena. It never has been. You stay because you know that out there you're just a girl with a needle. In here you're the queen of the man who runs it all." He let go of her then, the sudden absence of his warmth feeling like a physical blow. He stepped back, his expression smoothing into a mask of professional calm. Though his eyes remained dark, he reached down, gathered the fallen papers with a single sweeping motion, and placed them back in the drawer. "There is a charity gala at the end of the month," Arthur said, his tone shifting as if the previous 3 minutes had never happened. "The elite of the city will be there, the politicians, the old money, and the men who pretend their hands are clean. You will need a dress, not something you've fixed, but something you've built from the ground up." Eleanor stood there, her skin still tingling where he had touched her. She felt the weight of the debt, not Marcus's, but her own. A debt of gratitude, of fear, and of a burgeoning love that felt like a death sentence. "I'll make the dress," she said, her voice steadying. "But don't think for a second that I've forgiven you for Marcus." Arthur paused at the door, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "I wouldn't want you any other way, Elena. Softness is for the weak, and we have a long way to go before the night is over." As he walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the long marble hallway, Eleanor turned back to the window. The sleet had begun to fall, blurring the lights of the city. She thought of the emerald silk she had hidden in her sewing room, a fabric so rich it looked like deep water. She would wear it to the gala. She would stand by his side. But as she looked out into the dark, she saw a black car idling at the edge of the estate's gates, its headlights off, watching the house. She realized then that while Arthur was busy protecting her from the ghosts of her past, the demons of his present were already gathering at the door. The final days of January 1996 arrived with a biting frost that turned the London fog into a crystalline shroud. Inside the Grand Manor, however, the air was thick with the scent of cedar wood, expensive perfume, and the quiet, rhythmic snip of shears. Eleanor sat in the center of the sun-drenched morning room, her fingers moving with a precision that bordered on the divine. The fabric draped over her lap was a heavy, lustrous silk in a shade of emerald so deep it looked like the heart of an ancient forest. It was her masterpiece, a gown she had designed and sewn in the silence of her gilded confinement. Arthur stood in the doorway, his silhouette imposing against the mahogany frame. He didn't speak. He simply watched her. He had spent many hours like this over the past few weeks, finding a strange, meditative peace in her industry. To the world, he was a man of iron and blood, the shadow ruler of the docks who dictated the flow of commerce with a flick of his wrist. But here, in the presence of this woman and her needle, he felt a softness that terrified him. "It is nearly finished," Elena whispered, not looking up, though she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch. Arthur walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. He stopped just behind her, his presence radiating a heat that chased away the winter chill. He reached down, his large, scarred hand hovering over the emerald silk before his fingers finally brushed the fabric. "It is the color of your eyes when you are angry with me," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. Eleanor finally looked up, her neck arching back to meet his dark, intense stare. The tension between them was a living thing, a cord stretched to the point of snapping. "I am often angry with you, Arthur." "I know," he replied, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted his reputation. "But tonight, I want the world to see what I see. I want them to know that you are not a shadow in my house, but the light that guides it." The charity gala was held in a palatial ballroom in the heart of the city, a place where the old money of the aristocracy mingled with the new, dangerous wealth of men like Arthur. When they arrived, the charcoal sedan pulling up to the red carpet, the air seemed to still. Arthur stepped out first, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo, his expression a mask of cold indifference. Then he turned and offered his hand to Eleanor. As she emerged, the emerald silk shimmered under the flash of a dozen cameras. The dress moved like liquid, clinging to her curves before flaring out into a modest but elegant train. She had pinned her hair up, leaving her throat bare except for a single gold chain Arthur had given her, a simple piece that felt like a collar of loyalty. The moment his hand settled on the small of her back, Eleanor felt a surge of electricity. His palm was warm, his fingers splayed across the silk, guiding her forward with a possessiveness that made her breath catch. They entered the ballroom as a single unit, a king and his consort. The whispers followed them like a wake behind a ship. "Look at her," a woman in pearls hissed to her companion. "The little tailor's girl. He's turned her into a queen." Arthur's grip tightened slightly, his thumb grazing the bare skin above the low-cut back of her dress. It was a subtle, sensual claim, a reminder to everyone in the room and to her of who she belonged to. He didn't lead her to the bar or the buffet, he took her to the center of the room, forcing the elite to part before them. "You are trembling," Arthur whispered into her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "It's too much," Elena replied, her voice small. "Everyone is looking at us, as if we are a scandal waiting to happen." "Let them look," he said, his eyes scanning the room with the predatory grace of a wolf. "They look because they are afraid, and they are right to be. You are the only thing in this room that isn't for sale." Throughout the evening, Arthur was the perfect host of his own power. He spoke to lords and businessmen, his hand never leaving Elena's side. He introduced her not as an apprentice or a guest, but as his equal. He watched her with an intensity that never wavered, his eyes tracking the way she moved, the way she smiled tentatively at a compliment, the way her fingers nervously toyed with the emerald fabric of her skirt. At one point, while Arthur was deep in conversation with a port official, Elena felt a sudden chill. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She turned her head and saw a man standing by the towering ice sculpture at the far end of the room. He was younger than Arthur, with a face that was handsome in a cruel, sharp-edged way. Silas. He held a crystal flute of champagne, his eyes locked on her with a disturbing familiarity. He didn't look at her with admiration. He looked at her like a hunter assessing a target. When he caught her eye, he raised his glass in a mock toast. Before she could react, Arthur was there. He hadn't even been looking in her direction, but he had sensed the shift in her energy. He stepped in front of her, his broad shoulders shielding her from Silas's view. The air between the two men turned frigid. "Arthur," Silas said, his voice carrying across the immediate circle, drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. He walked forward, his smile not reaching his eyes. "A magnificent evening, and an even more magnificent companion. I didn't realize the rumors of your softening were so well-founded." The room went silent. Our toast from a rival was never just a toast, it was a challenge. Arthur's expression didn't change, but Elena felt the muscles in his arm turn to stone. "Softening, Silas? You mistake a choice for a weakness." Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. He looked past Arthur's shoulder to Elena, his gaze lingering on the emerald silk. "She is exquisite, a rare jewel. But jewels are easily stolen if the owner becomes too distracted by their shine. To your new vulnerability, Arthur. May it serve you better than your old strength." Silas drained his glass and set it on a passing waiter's tray, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's. The threat was as clear as the winter moon. He wasn't just declaring war on Arthur, he was declaring war on her. Arthur didn't respond with a shout or a blow. He simply leaned in closer to Elena, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. The physical intimacy was a shield and a statement. "We are leaving," he said quietly, his voice laced with a lethal promise. As they walked back through the ballroom, the glamour of the night felt tarnished. The emerald dress, which had felt like a triumph only an hour ago, now felt like a target. Arthur's pace was hurried, his hand gripping her with a ferocity that bordered on painful. They reached the foyer, the cold night air hitting them like a physical blow. The valet brought the sedan around and Arthur practically lifted her into the back seat. As the door closed, the silence of the car felt heavy, suffocating. Arthur sat beside her, his chest heaving slightly. He reached out, his hand trembling with a suppressed rage, and took her chin in his fingers, forcing her to look at him. "He will not touch you," Arthur swore, his voice a jagged edge. "I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let him breathe the same air as you." Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw the monster she had tried to ignore. It was there, raw and hungry, fueled by a protectiveness that felt like a cage. She realized then that the gala hadn't been a celebration. It had been an unveiling. As the car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the London fog, Eleanor looked out the rear window. In the shadows of the hotel entrance, she saw a man standing alone, watching them go. It wasn't Silas. It was someone else. Someone with a camera, capturing the moment their vulnerabilities were laid bare for the world to see. The drive back to the manor was silent, but the air was charged with a new, frantic energy. When they finally stepped through the heavy oak doors of the estate, Arthur didn't let her go to her room. He led her toward his study, his grip on her hand unrelenting, his mind already spinning a web of defense that would soon turn her sanctuary into a fortress of secrets. The air inside the manor felt thick, like old velvet soaked in a week of heavy rain. It was late January in 1996, and the world outside the high stone walls was a blur of grey mist and biting wind. Inside, the opulence was suffocating. Eleanor sat in the sunroom, her fingers moving rhythmically as she stitched a delicate lace trim onto a piece of ivory silk. To any outsider, she lived a life of unimaginable luxury, surrounded by fine art, expensive scotch, and the unwavering protection of the most powerful man in East London. But to Elena, every gilded moulding and plush carpet felt like a layer of insulation separating her from the person she used to be. Earlier that evening, Arthur had returned from a meeting at the docks, his presence filling the room like a sudden change in atmospheric pressure. He hadn't said a word, merely walked behind her and placed his hands on her shoulders. His palms were warm, the skin slightly rough from years of a life she could only imagine, and he had leaned down to press a slow, lingering kiss to the side of her neck. The sensation had sent a shiver through her, a complex mixture of genuine desire and an ache of growing resentment. He held her with a possessiveness that was both a shield and a shackle. He didn't just want her heart. He wanted to own the very air she breathed. When Arthur retired to his private library to take a call from Julian, Elena found herself wandering the corridors. She felt a restless energy beneath her skin, a need to find something solid and real in a house built on secrets. She eventually found herself in Arthur's study, a room she usually avoided. It smelled of old leather and tobacco, a masculine sanctuary that felt like the true heart of his empire. She wasn't looking for a betrayal, she was looking for a pen to jot down a design idea that had been haunting her. But as she reached into the top drawer of his massive mahogany desk, her hand brushed against a small, inconspicuous catch beneath the rim. With a soft click that sounded like a bone snapping in the silence of the room, a hidden compartment slid forward. Elena's breath hitched. Inside were several manila envelopes. She pulled the first one out, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. As she spilled the contents onto the blotter, her world tilted. There were dozens of photographs. They weren't just of her, though there were plenty of those, taken from the shadows as she walked to the tailor shop or waited for the bus in the rain months ago. There were photos of her brother Marcus leaving his flat. There were photos of her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, tending to her window boxes. There were even shots of the small dingy cafe where she used to buy a single pastry on Sunday mornings. Each photo was meticulously dated in Arthur's sharp, precise handwriting. The surveillance had started long before he had ever stepped into the tailor shop to have his measurements taken. He hadn't fallen for her by chance, he had hunted her. He had mapped out her life, identified her vulnerabilities, and moved in with the surgical precision of a general. The protection he offered wasn't a response to her needs. It was a cage he had built around her before she even knew he existed. "What are you doing, Elena?" The voice was low, vibrating through the floorboards. She spun around, her face pale, the photos scattered across the desk like fallen leaves. Arthur stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. He didn't look angry. He looked calm, which was infinitely more terrifying. "You've been following me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Since before we even met, you watched my brother, you watched my friends. You didn't save me, Arthur. You trapped me." Arthur walked into the room, his footsteps silent on the Persian rug. He stopped just inches from her, his sheer physical size looming over her. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, but she flinched away from his touch. His eyes darkened, a flash of something wounded and ancient flickering in their depths. "In my world, Elena, there is no such thing as a coincidence," he said, his voice a gravelly silk. "I saw something I wanted, something pure and beautiful in a city that is neither. I made sure that nothing could touch you. I made sure your brother's debts didn't bury him. I ensured your safety. That isn't a trap, it's a devotion." "It's ownership," she shouted, the sound echoing off the rows of leather-bound books. "I am a person, Arthur, not a project, not a trophy you win by manipulating the board. You made me believe you were a savior, but you're just a jailer with better taste in suits." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. Arthur didn't move. He stood there, the king of the docks, a man who could command hundreds with a single nod, and yet he looked utterly powerless in the face of her fury. "I love you," he said, the words sounding foreign and strained, as if he weren't used to the weight of them. "You love the idea of me," Eleanor countered, tears finally spilling over. "You love having something that the world can't corrupt. But you're the one corrupting it, Arthur. You've turned my whole life into a lie." She didn't wait for his response. She pushed past him, her silk dress rustling as she fled the room. She didn't take any of the fine clothes he had bought her. She grabbed her old heavy wool coat from the cloakroom, the one she had worn that first night in the rain, and her small handbag. The security guards at the front door hesitated, looking toward the top of the stairs, where Arthur stood in the shadows of the landing. Arthur raised a single hand, a silent command to let her go. He stood motionless, watching her disappear into the freezing London night. He knew the city better than anyone. He knew the dangers that lurked in the alleyways and the shadows. He felt a sudden, sharp void in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a boy. He had the money, the power, and the influence, but as the heavy front door clicked shut, the manor felt like a tomb. Elena ran until her lungs burned. She hailed a black cab, her hands shaking so violently she could barely count out the coins for the fare. When she finally arrived at her old apartment, a cramped one-bedroom space in a crumbling brick building, the air was frigid. It had been empty for weeks, and the scent of dust and stale air greeted her like a ghost. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat on the edge of her small bed, wrapping her coat tightly around her. The luxury of the manor felt like a dream she had finally woken up from, but the reality was cold and unforgiving. She looked at her hands, still smelling faintly of the expensive lavender soap from Arthur's bathroom. She was free. That was what she told herself as she stared at the cracked plaster of the ceiling. She had her autonomy back. But as the minutes ticked by into the early hours of the morning, a new sensation began to take hold, a prickling at the back of her neck. The apartment was too quiet. The street outside was too still. She realized then that Arthur's world didn't just end because she had walked away from it. Silas was still out there. The rivalries were still simmering. And as she looked toward her window, she saw the faint reflection of a car parked across the street, its engine idling, two red taillights glowing like the eyes of a predator waiting in the dark. She wasn't just alone. She was a target. The cold in East London during the final days of December 1995 was a living thing, a biting, damp entity that seeped through the cracks of the floorboards and settled in the marrow of one's bones. Elena sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands tucked under her thighs for warmth. She had been back in her small apartment for 3 days, trying to reclaim the life she had known before the velvet curtains and silk sheets of Arthur's manor had threatened to swallow her whole. The silence of her flat was supposed to be a relief, a return to the humble reality she understood. But as she stared at the peeling wallpaper, the quiet felt heavy, pregnant with the ghost of a man who had become the sun around which her world gravitated. She missed the scent of him, the expensive tobacco, the sharp hint of sandalwood, and the underlying metallic tang of a life lived on the edge of violence. She missed the way his eyes, dark and unreadable, would soften only when they landed on her. She had left because she was afraid of losing herself. In Arthur's world, she was a protected gem, a creature of beauty to be guarded and curated. In this drafty room, she was just Eleanor again, or so she had hoped. A sudden, sharp snap from the hallway made her heart hammer against her ribs. It wasn't the usual groan of the old building settling into the frost. It was the distinct sound of a door being forced. Elena stood, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes darting to the heavy iron frying pan on the kitchenette counter. Before she could move, the front door to her apartment swung open with a sickening groan of tortured wood. 3 men entered. They didn't look like the polished guards Arthur employed. These men were jagged, their faces scarred by the desperate streets of the docks, their eyes devoid of the professional restraint she had grown accustomed to. The leader, a man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw, didn't approach her. Instead, he signaled to the others. "Don't touch her," the man rasped, his voice like gravel grinding together. "Silas says we only leave a reminder." Elena watched in frozen horror as they began to systematically dismantle her life. They didn't steal. They destroyed. Her sewing machine, the one she had saved for 2 years to buy, was shoved off the table, its delicate internal components shattering across the linoleum. Her sketches, months of work and dreams, were ripped from the walls and shredded into confetti. They overturned her small dresser, spilling her modest belongings onto the floor. But the true cruelty was saved for the end. The leader walked toward her bed. Elena recoiled, her back hitting the cold glass of the window, but he ignored her. From a paper bag he pulled out a garment. It was a simple, floral cotton dress, the very one she had been wearing on that rainy November day when she had first caught Arthur's eye. It was the dress she had been trying to mend at the bus stop, the one that had snagged and torn. With a slow, deliberate motion, the man gripped the fabric. The sound of the cotton rending was louder than a gunshot in the small room. He tore it into jagged strips and tossed them onto her pillow. "Arthur thinks he can keep things nice," the man sneered, leaning in just close enough for Elena to smell the sour stench of gin on his breath. "Tell him Silas is coming for the seams. Tell him everything he loves is going to unravel." Then, as quickly as they had arrived, they were gone. The apartment door swung on its broken hinge, clicking rhythmically against the frame. Eleanor's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor amidst the wreckage of her sewing supplies. Her chest felt tight, her lungs refusing to take in enough air. She was trembling so violently that her teeth clattered. She looked at the torn floral dress, the symbol of her ordinary life, and realized that the safety she had sought in her independence was an illusion. Silas didn't see her as a woman. He saw her as a vulnerability, a chink in Arthur's armor. With shaking fingers, she reached for the rotary phone that sat on the floor, its cord stretched taut. There was only one number she had memorized, a number she had sworn she would never call. The line picked up on the second ring. There was no hello, only the heavy, expectant silence of a man who knew the weight of a phone call in the middle of the night. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. "I'm coming," he replied. 2 words, delivered with a terrifying, calm certainty. She didn't know how much time passed as she sat in the dark, clutching a piece of the torn floral fabric to her chest. The street outside was quiet until the low, powerful thrum of a high-performance engine vibrated through the floorboards. A car door slammed, a sound of finality. Seconds later, Arthur was there. He didn't burst in. He filled the doorway like a storm cloud blocking out the light. He was dressed in a dark wool overcoat, his hair damp from the mist. His eyes swept over the room, taking in the shattered machine, the shredded sketches, and finally the woman huddled on the floor. He moved toward her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. When he reached her, he didn't ask if she was hurt. He knelt, his large, calloused hands reaching out to cup her face. The heat from his skin was startling against her frozen cheeks. "Look at me, Elena," he commanded softly. She lifted her gaze, seeing the raw, predatory fire burning in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had seen the world in shades of grey and had finally found the one thing he was willing to burn it all down for. "I thought I could leave," she sobbed, the tears finally breaking through. "I thought I could just be me again." "There is no you without me anymore," Arthur said, his voice a low growl of possessiveness. "And there is no me without you. They made a mistake. They thought they could scare you away from me. All they've done is ensure I never let you out of my sight again." He stood, pulling her up with him. He was so much larger than her, a pillar of strength in the wreckage of her life. He stripped off his heavy overcoat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was warm, smelling of him, and it felt like a suit of armor. He pulled her flush against his chest, his arms locking around her waist with a grip that was both a sanctuary and a cage. Elena pressed her face into the silk of his tie, her fingers clutching the lapels of his suit jacket. She felt the steady, powerful thud of his heart, and for the first time since the door had been kicked in, she felt her own heart begin to steady. "Julian is outside," Arthur said, his chin resting on top of her head. "He will take your things. What can be saved, we will save. What cannot, I will replace 10 times over." "Arthur, the dress—" She gestured vaguely toward the bed. He looked at the torn floral fabric, and for a fleeting second his expression shifted to something hauntingly sad before hardening into ice. "That dress is the past, Elena. Silas wants to play with ghosts. I'm going to show him what happens when you touch the living." He led her out of the apartment, his arm never leaving her shoulders. As they descended the narrow stairs, the neighbors peered through their cracked doors, but one look at Arthur's face sent them scurrying back into the shadows. He was a king reclaiming his prize, and the air around him crackled with the promise of a coming retribution. They reached the charcoal sedan waiting at the curb. Julian stood by the open door, his face a mask of professional neutrality, though his eyes lingered on the jagged marks on the apartment door. As Arthur helped Elena into the back seat, he paused, looking back at the darkened windows of the tenement building. The rain began to fall again, a cold, relentless drizzle that slicked the cobblestones. "Take her home," Arthur instructed Julian, his voice devoid of emotion. "Keep the guards on the perimeter. No one goes in or out without my personal word." "Where are you going, Arthur?" Elena asked, reaching out from the shadows of the car to catch his hand. Her fingers brushed the gold watch on his wrist, the metal cold against her skin. He leaned down, pressing a firm, lingering kiss to her forehead. His lips were cool, but his breath was hot against her skin. "I have to remind this city who owns the docks, Elena, and I have to make sure Silas understands that he didn't just tear a dress tonight, he tore the piece." He closed the car door, the heavy thud echoing through the empty street. As the sedan pulled away, Elena watched through the rear window as Arthur stood alone in the rain, his figure shrinking into the mist, a lone wolf preparing for a hunt that would change the landscape of London forever. She realized then that the war had moved from the shadows of the shipping crates directly into her heart, and there was no turning back. The car turned the corner, leaving the East End behind, but as Elena huddled into the warmth of Arthur's coat, she found a small, sharp piece of metal tucked into the pocket, a heavy brass casing that smelled of gunpowder and old debts. The atmosphere within the manor had shifted from a quiet, gilded sanctuary into the humming nerve center of a silent war. It was mid-February in 1996, and the frost clung to the window panes like jagged lace. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of bitter coffee, expensive tobacco, and the ozone of high-stakes tension. Eleanor sat in the library, a room she had come to love for its floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound history, but today the history being made was much darker. She watched through the half-open door as men in sharp charcoal suits moved with predatory efficiency through the foyer. Julian, Arthur's right-hand man, stood by a massive mahogany table strewn with ledger books and maps of the Thames. He was speaking into a telephone, his voice a low, rhythmic growl as he coordinated the systematic dismantling of Silas's empire. There were no raised voices, no chaotic shouting. This was the surgical removal of a cancer, directed by a man who understood that true power didn't scream. It whispered and waited. Eleanor felt a strange, hollow ache in her chest. She had seen the torn floral dress Silas's men had left on her bed, a cruel reminder of her vulnerability. She knew that what Arthur was doing was for her, a shield forged in fire to protect her from the shadows. Yet, seeing the cold machinery of his world in full operation was different from hearing rumors of it. This was the man who had watched her fix her dress in the rain, now commanding a small army to ensure she never had to feel afraid again. "He won't be back until the tide turns," a voice said softly. Eleanor turned to see Clara leaning against the doorframe. Arthur's sister was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper instincts. She held a glass of dark amber liquid, her eyes tracing the movement of the men in the hall with a weary sort of pride. "Is it always like this?" Elena asked, her voice barely a breath. "When someone is foolish enough to touch what belongs to him?" "Yes," Clara replied, stepping into the room. She walked to the window, staring out at the grey London sky. "Arthur doesn't just defeat his enemies, Elena. He erases the ground they stand on. By tomorrow morning, Silas will find that his warehouses are empty, his bank accounts are frozen, and the men he thought were his brothers have suddenly forgotten his name." Elena looked down at her hands. She had been sewing a silk lining for a new coat, but the needle sat idle. "It's a lot of blood on his hands for one woman." "It's not just about you," Clara said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "It's about the precedent. But make no mistake, you are the spark that lit this particular fuse. He hasn't slept in 3 days. He won't rest until he knows the city is quiet enough for you to breathe." The night dragged on, a marathon of ticking clocks and muffled reports. Elena stayed in the library, unable to sleep, wrapped in one of Arthur's heavy cashmere cardigans. It smelled of him, sandalwood and the faint metallic scent of the docks. She felt like a passenger on a ship caught in a storm, trusting the captain even as the waves threatened to swallow everything whole. It was long after the moon had reached its peak when the front doors finally groaned open. The frantic energy of the house settled into a heavy, respectful silence. Elena stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs as she moved into the foyer. Arthur stood there, framed by the cold mist rolling in from the gardens. His long wool coat was draped over his broad shoulders, dusted with the dampness of the river. His face was a mask of exhaustion, his jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. When his eyes found hers, the icy hardness in them shattered, replaced by a raw, aching relief. He looked like a king returning from a slaughter, weary of the crown, but unwilling to let it fall. He didn't say a word as he walked toward her. The men in the hall melted away into the shadows, sensing the intimacy of the moment. When he reached her, he didn't grab her or demand her attention. He simply leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closing as he took a deep, shuddering breath. "It's done," he rasped. His voice was gravelly, worn thin by command and lack of rest. Elena reached up, her small hands cupping his face. His skin was cold, bitten by the winter air, but the heat radiating from him was intense. She could smell the smoke of the docks on him, the scent of something burned away. "Are you hurt?" she whispered. Arthur shook his head slightly, his hands coming up to rest on her waist, pulling her flush against him. The physical contact was electric, a grounding force for both of them. "I'm just tired, Elena, so tired of the noise." He led her up the grand staircase, his arm draped heavily around her shoulders. In the privacy of his master suite, the world outside ceased to exist. There were no ledgers here, no maps of territory, only the soft glow of a dying fire in the hearth. Arthur shed his coat and waistcoat, dropping them onto a chair with a heavy thud. He sat on the edge of the expansive bed, burying his face in his hands. Elena moved behind him, her fingers tentatively reaching out to massage the knotted muscles of his shoulders. She felt the incredible tension held within his frame, the weight of 1,000 decisions, the burden of a man who ruled by fear, but loved with a desperation that terrified him. "You didn't have to go that far," she said softly, her thumbs pressing into the base of his neck. Arthur turned his head, looking up at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He reached back, grabbing her hand and pulling it to his lips. He kissed her palm, his unshaven chin grazing her soft skin. "I would burn this entire city to the ground if it meant you could walk down a single street without looking over your shoulder. Silas thought he could use you to get to me. He forgot that you aren't my weakness, Elena. You're the only reason I bother to keep the world spinning." The honesty in his voice was more overwhelming than his power. He pulled her around to face him, his hands sliding up her arms to her shoulders, drawing her between his knees. The air between them grew thick and heavy, charged with the relief of survival and the simmering heat of a connection that had been tested in the dark. He leaned in, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin of her neck, a slow, deliberate caress that sent shivers racing down her spine. Eleanor tilted her head back, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. The contrast between his rugged, violent world and the tenderness of his touch was a dizzying contradiction. He was a monster to the city, a master of the docks who could break a man's life with a single phone call, but here in the shadows of the manor, he was hers. "Stay with me," he murmured against her skin, his voice a plea disguised as a command. "Don't go back to the apartment. Not yet. Not until I've scrubbed the scent of him off the streets." "I'm not going anywhere, Arthur," she promised, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. As the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the heavy curtains, Arthur finally succumbed to sleep, his head resting in Elena's lap as she sat against the headboard. She watched his chest rise and fall, the rhythmic peace a stark contrast to the chaos of the last few days. She realized then that she was no longer the humble apprentice she had been in November. She was the anchor for a man who had none, the silent queen of a kingdom built on iron and shadows. However, as she looked toward the door, she saw a sliver of light from the hallway. A shadow moved across the gap, Clara watching them with a look that wasn't of relief, but of deep, calculated concern. The war with Silas might have been won, but Elena realized that the true battle for her soul was only just beginning within the walls of the manor itself. The frost of February 1996 clung to the window panes of the manor like skeletal fingers, blurring the view of the sprawling gardens outside. Inside the sunroom, the air was thick with the scent of lavender and the metallic tang of sewing needles. Elena sat bathed in the pale, rhythmic light of a winter morning, her fingers dancing over a piece of ivory silk. It was a far cry from the rain-slicked cobblestones where she had once stood, shivering and broken, trying to mend a torn floral hem. Now, she handled fabrics that cost more than her father had earned in a decade. Yet despite the opulence, a heavy weight sat in her chest, a premonition of the choice she knew was coming. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and the clicking of high heels announced Clara's arrival. Arthur's sister was a woman composed of sharp angles and even sharper silences. She moved with a calculated grace, her charcoal suit tailored to perfection, a testament to the family's proximity to both power and the aesthetics of it. Clara stopped at the edge of the sunroom, her eyes scanning the intricate embroidery Elena was working on. "It's beautiful," Clara said, though her voice carried no warmth. It was a cold assessment of value. "But beauty is a fragile thing in this house, Elena. It wilts under the pressure of what Arthur does." Eleanor didn't look up, though her heart began a frantic tattoo against her ribs. "He protects what he loves, Clara. I've seen it." "He possesses what he loves," Clara corrected, stepping closer. The scent of her expensive, biting perfume filled the space between them. "There is a difference. Right now he is a man possessed by you. He has turned the city upside down to keep you safe from Silas, but in doing so, he has made himself a target. And you are the bullseye." Clara reached into the pocket of her blazer and withdrew a thick cream-colored envelope. She laid it on the work table, right on top of the delicate silk. Eleanor finally looked up, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and growing dread. "Inside that envelope is a bank draft for £50,000, Clara said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There is also a first-class ticket to Marseille. I have a friend there, a woman who runs an atelier that rivals anything in London. You could be a designer, Elena. Not just a girl in a gilded cage, but a woman with a name and a future that doesn't involve checking the underside of her car for explosives." Eleanor stared at the envelope. It represented a life of peace, a return to the simplicity she had once craved when she was shivering at that bus stop. No more shadows, no more blood-stained knuckles, no more of the terrifying intensity that was Arthur. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "Do you hate me that much?" "On the contrary," Clara sighed, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the gangster's sister slipped, revealing a tired, lonely woman. "I like you. You remind me of who I was before the docks and the debts turned my heart to stone. If you stay, Arthur will consume you. He will turn you into something that can survive him. And by then, the girl who fixed her dress in the rain will be dead. Go, Eleanor. Go while you still have a soul to save." Clara turned and left without another word, her heels clicking a rhythmic warning down the hall. Eleanor sat in the silence, the envelope staring back at her like a predatory eye. She thought of the way Arthur looked at her, not as a prize, but as his only anchor in a world of chaos. She thought of the heat of his body against hers in the dead of night, the way his rough hands became impossibly gentle when they touched her skin. She was still staring at the ticket when the door opened again. This time, there was no clicking of heels, only the heavy, authoritative thud of leather boots. Arthur. He looked exhausted. The lines around his eyes had deepened in the last few weeks, and there was a fresh bruise blooming along his jawline. He didn't speak. He simply walked over to her and stood behind her chair. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his thumbs rubbing small, soothing circles into the tension of her muscles. The heat of him radiated through her thin blouse, a grounding force that made the room feel smaller, safer, and infinitely more dangerous all at once. "Clara was here," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her spine. "She was," Elena whispered. Arthur's gaze fell on the envelope. He didn't move to take it. He didn't demand to know what was inside. He simply waited, his presence an unspoken question. Eleanor felt the power he held, the power to crush Silas, to move the gears of the city, and yet, here he was, vulnerable to the decision of a humble woman with a needle and thread. He leaned down, his face pressing into the crook of her neck. His breath was warm, smelling of cedarwood and the cold winter air. He trailed a row of slow, lingering kisses along the sensitive cord of her neck, his lips firm and possessive. Elena's eyes fluttered shut as a wave of heat washed over her, drowning out the logical voice that told her to take the money and run. When his hand moved from her shoulder to the base of her throat, his fingers splayed across her collarbone, she felt the sheer magnetism of the man. He wasn't just a gangster. He was her entire world. "She thinks I'm a monster," Arthur murmured against her skin. "She thinks I'll break you." "Will you?" Eleanor asked, turning in his arms so she could look into those dark, turbulent eyes. Arthur reached out, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. "I would burn this city to the ground before I let a single hair on your head be harmed. But Clara is right about one thing. My world is a storm. I can't promise you sunshine, Eleanor. I can only promise that I will be the one holding the umbrella." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist with a strength that was both a sanctuary and a shackle. Elena pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady, heavy thud of his heart. She realized then that she didn't want the quiet life in Marseille. She didn't want the safety of a world without him. The fire in the hearth crackled, throwing orange light across the room. With a sudden, decisive movement, Eleanor reached for the envelope. Arthur's grip tightened for a fraction of a second, his body tensing as if bracing for a blow. She walked toward the fireplace, the ivory silk of her half-finished work trailing behind her like a ghostly train. Without hesitation, she tossed the envelope into the dancing flames, The paper curled and blackened, the ticket to another life turning into ash in seconds. The £50,000 vanished into the heat, a sacrifice on the altar of a love that defied common sense. Elena turned back to him. The look on Arthur's face was one she would never forget, a mixture of profound relief and a dark, simmering triumph. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, taking her face in his hands. He kissed her then, a deep, desperate kiss that tasted of salt and soot. It was a seal on her choice, a pact made in the heart of the den. "You chose the lion," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "I chose you," she corrected. Arthur stepped back, his expression hardening into the mask of the man who ruled the docks. He reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded note. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from intimate to lethal. "Then it's time you knew," he said, his voice cold as the frost on the glass. "Silas didn't just trash your apartment to scare you. He's been moving shipments through the Eastern Terminal under my name. He's trying to frame me for a hit on the Crown's own customs agents. If he succeeds, there won't be enough money or influence in Britain to keep us out of a cage." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. The war wasn't over. It was merely entering its most violent phase. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Arthur looked toward the window, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the cranes at the docks. "I'm going to meet him tonight, alone. Or so he thinks." He turned back to her, his hand lingering one last time on the curve of her hip. "Stay in the manor. Don't open the door for anyone but Julian. When I come back, the city will belong to us, or it will be a grave for us both." As he walked out of the room, the silence that followed was louder than any scream. Eleanor looked down at the ivory silk on her table, noticing for the first time that a single drop of red ink, or was it blood, had stained the hem of her work. The choice was made, but as she watched the sun begin to dip below the horizon, she realized that the lion's victory always came with a price that had to be paid in more than just silk and ash. Through the window, she saw a black sedan idling at the gate, its headlights cutting through the growing gloom like the eyes of a beast waiting for the signal to strike. The fog off the Thames was a thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed the towering silhouettes of the cranes at the shipping docks. It was March of 1996, a month of biting winds and lingering shadows. Arthur stood on the edge of the pier, the collar of his wool coat turned up against the dampness. He was alone, or so it appeared to anyone watching from the rusted skeletons of the warehouses. In reality, the entire district was a web of his making, but for this moment, he wanted the silence. He wanted the weight of the night to press against him. Silas arrived with the rattling of a dying engine and the harsh glare of yellow headlights cutting through the mist. He stepped out of his vehicle, followed by 4 men who looked like they had been forged in the same furnace of desperation and cruelty. Silas was a man who thrived on the chaos of the streets, but as he stepped onto the wet timber of the dock, he looked out of place against the backdrop of Arthur's industrial kingdom. "You're a hard man to pin down, Arthur," Silas called out, his voice raspy, echoing off the corrugated iron walls. "I thought maybe you were too busy playing house with your little seamstress to remember how the world actually works." Arthur didn't flinch. The mention of Elena usually ignited a fire in his chest, a protective rage that had driven him to dismantle entire organizations. But tonight, he was as cold as the river. He had spent the last 72 hours orchestrating a masterpiece of destruction that didn't require a single bullet. "I remember exactly how the world works, Silas," Arthur replied, his voice low and steady. He began to walk toward the other man, his footsteps measured and heavy. "It works on the principle of foundations. When a foundation is rotten, the whole structure collapses. You thought you were building an empire, but you were just squatting in my shadow." Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I took your territory in the north. I bled your suppliers. So I'm standing here with 5 men, and you're standing there with nothing but a fancy coat." Arthur stopped exactly 6 feet from him. The light from a flickering street lamp caught the sharp planes of his face. "You didn't take my territory, Silas. I let you have it. Those suppliers you think you own, they've been feeding you poisoned accounts for months. Every pound you've moved through the docks has been tracked. Every bribe you've paid was to men who work for me." Silas's smile faltered. He looked at his men, then back at Arthur. "You're bluffing." Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He didn't hand it over. He simply held it up. "In here is the paper trail of every illegal transaction you've made since 1994. It's not going to the police, Silas. That would be too easy. It's going to your backers in the city, the men who actually have the money. I've already spoken to them. They know you've been skimming off the top to fund your little war against me. They don't like thieves, Silas, and they certainly don't like losers." The silence that followed was heavy. The only sound was the distant lap of the water against the pilings. Silas's men shifted uncomfortably. They weren't soldiers, they were mercenaries, and they could smell the shift in power. "You're a ghost, Silas," Arthur continued, his eyes piercing. "By tomorrow morning, your bank accounts will be frozen. Your properties will be seized by the very men who lent you the money to buy them. You won't even be able to buy a cup of tea in this city without someone looking over their shoulder to see if I'm watching. You're not worth the price of a grave." The bravado drained from Silas's face, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. He looked around the docks, realizing for the first time that the cranes, the containers, and the very ground he stood on belonged to the man in front of him. Arthur had destroyed him without raising a hand. It was a surgical removal of a man's soul. Without another word, Arthur turned his back on them. It was the ultimate insult, the ultimate display of confidence. He walked toward his waiting car, the charcoal sedan idling in the shadows. He didn't look back to see Silas collapse onto his knees or to see his men desert him in the fog. He had a different destination in mind. The drive back to the manor was a blur of streetlights and rain. When he arrived, the house was quiet, save for the crackle of the fireplace in the main parlor. He found Elena sitting by the hearth, a piece of cream-colored silk draped over her lap. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face for the marks of the night. He was covered in the scent of the docks, salt, iron, and the cold, but as he approached her, the tension in his shoulders began to melt. He didn't say a word. He simply knelt at her feet, much as he had done weeks before, and rested his head against her knees. Elena's hands, those small, gifted hands that could create beauty out of nothing, moved to his hair. She stroked his head with a tenderness that made his throat tighten. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It's over," he murmured into the silk of her dress. "He's gone, not dead, but gone. He'll never touch you again. He'll never even hear your name." He shifted, sitting back on his heels so he could look at her. The firelight played across her skin, highlighting the softness of her cheeks and the deep, soulful brown of her eyes. Arthur reached up, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His skin was rough against hers, a reminder of the two different worlds they inhabited, but the way she leaned into his touch told him everything he needed to know. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist as she sat in the chair. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of lavender and the faint metallic tang of the sewing needles she often held in her mouth. His hands moved slowly up her back, feeling the delicate ridges of her spine through the fabric. The intimacy was a physical ache, a bridge between the violence he had just finished and the peace he found only with her. "I was so afraid," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "Not for me, for you. I thought the city would take you away from me." Arthur pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. He took her hand and pressed a lingering kiss to her palm, his lips warm and firm. "The city belongs to me, Elena, but I belong to you. There isn't a man in London strong enough to take me away from this." He stood up, pulling her with him. They stood in the glow of the dying embers, two figures silhouetted against the vastness of the room. He leaned down, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was both a promise and a seal of their victory. It was deep and slow, tasting of relief and a simmering passion that had been held at bay by the looming threat of Silas. His hands moved to the small of her back, pressing her body against his. He could feel the rapid beat of her heart against his chest, a frantic rhythm that matched his own. The world outside the manor, the docks, the money, the blood, didn't exist in this space. There was only the weight of her body against his and the heat of the fire. He whispered her name against her lips, a prayer and a vow. She was the anchor that kept him from drifting into the dark, and tonight He had ensured that their anchor was buried deep in the solid earth. As the night deepened, Arthur led her toward the stairs, his hand never leaving hers. But as they reached the first landing, a flash of light from the driveway caught his eye. A car was approaching, its headlights cutting through the darkness of the estate's long drive. Arthur froze, his instincts instantly on high alert. He had thought the war was over, that Silas was a ghost, but in his world, a vacuum was always filled, and the morning light often brought new shadows that even a king couldn't predict. The air in London had finally lost its bite by the time April of 1996 rolled across the city. The damp, bone-chilling fog of the previous winter had been replaced by a soft, persistent mist that smelled of rain and blooming jasmine. From the wide stone balcony of their new residence, a sprawling estate that overlooked the serpentine curves of the Thames, the world looked different. The river was no longer a dark, rushing grave for secrets. It was a vein of liquid silver, reflecting the amber glow of a city that had finally learned to hold its breath in the presence of Arthur. Inside the house, the silence was heavy, but no longer suffocating. It was the silence of a kingdom at peace. Arthur stood in the center of the master suite, his large frame silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He wore a charcoal suit of the finest wool, a piece crafted by the very hands that had once trembled while pinning a torn floral dress at a rain-slicked bus stop. He looked every bit the man who moved the foundations of the shipping docks, but there was a stillness in him now, a quietude that had only taken root since the fall of Silas. The downfall of his rival had not been the explosive, cinematic end many in the underworld had expected. Arthur had always been a man of calculated precision. He had dismantled Silas piece by piece, stripping away his warehouses, his influence with the local constabulary, and finally, his dignity. Silas had not disappeared into the river. He had been forced into a humiliating exile, a ghost of a man wandering the outskirts of the city with nothing left but the clothes on his back and the knowledge that he had tried to strike at the one thing Arthur held sacred. It was a fate worse than death in their world, to be a nobody in a city that used to fear your name. A soft rustle of silk announced Elena's presence. She stepped out from her private dressing room, and for a moment Arthur forgot how to breathe. She was dressed in a gown of her own design, a deep, midnight blue silk that seemed to catch every stray beam of light in the room. The fabric hugged her curves with a possessive grace, trailing behind her like a whisper of the life she had built from the ruins of her struggle. She was no longer the bedraggled apprentice he had watched from the shadows of his sedan. She was the owner of one of the most prestigious fashion houses in Mayfair, a gift Arthur had bestowed not out of charity, but out of a fierce, burning respect for her talent. She walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. When she reached him, she didn't speak. She simply reached out, her small, calloused fingers, still marked by the tiny pricks of 1,000 needles, finding the cuff of his shirt. She noticed a slight misalignment in the gold link and began to adjust it with focused intensity. Arthur watched her, his gaze hooded and intense. He remembered the first time he had seen her, drenched and desperate, trying to save a cheap floral dress from a rusted bench. He remembered the raw, unyielding resilience in her eyes. Now those same eyes were calm, filled with a depth of emotion that he still found himself trying to navigate. He reached out, his large hand covering hers, stilling her movements. The contrast was stark, his skin tanned and roughened by years of violence and command, hers pale and soft, yet possessing a strength that had anchored him through the bloodiest months of his life. "It's perfect, Elena," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the small space between them. She looked up at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Nothing is ever truly perfect, Arthur. There is always a stitch that can be tighter, a line that can be cleaner. You are," he countered, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw. He moved his hand to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the loose curls he had come to adore. He pulled her closer, until the warmth of her body seeped through his layers of wool and silk. The scent of her, sandalwood and expensive fabric, overwhelmed his senses. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. This was the intimacy that terrified him more than any gun or blade. It was a vulnerability he had never intended to permit, yet here she was, the heartbeat of his empire. He thought of the photos he had once kept of her family, the surveillance he had used to justify his obsession. He didn't need to watch her from the shadows anymore. She was the sun around which his entire world now orbited. "Clara asked me if I regretted staying," Eleanor whispered, her breath warm against his skin. Arthur felt a momentary tightening in his chest. His sister had always been the voice of cold reality, the one who saw the thorns beneath the roses. "She said this world would change me, that I would become like all of you." Arthur pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "And what did you tell her?" Eleanor reached up, her hands framing his face. Her touch was a benediction. "I told her that the world was already cold. You were just the only one who bothered to build a fire for me. I didn't choose the violence, Arthur. I chose the man who stands between me and the dark. I would choose you 1,000 times over, in any life, in any city." The honesty in her voice was a physical weight. Arthur felt a surge of protectiveness, so fierce it felt like a brand. He swept her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was desperate and hungry, yet tempered by a profound tenderness. It was a seal on the contract they had signed with their lives, a promise that as long as he drew breath, the girl in the torn dress would never have to worry about the rain again. He led her to the balcony, his arm draped firmly around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. Together they looked out over London. The city was theirs. The docks, the warehouses, the high-end shops of Mayfair, and the dark alleys of the East End, all of it moved according to his will, and he moved according to hers. Arthur realized then that justice was a fickle thing. In a world of shadows, the only real justice was the ability to protect what you loved. He had not renounced his power. He had refined it. He had not walked away from his wealth. He had used it to build a fortress for the one person who saw the man beneath the monster. As the bells of a distant cathedral chimed the passing of another hour, Arthur looked at Elena one last time before the night claimed them. She was leaning against the stone railing, her profile etched in gold by the rising moon. She was the masterpiece of his life, a testament to the fact that even in the grit and grime of a city built on secrets, beauty could not only survive, it could rule. He took her hand, kissing the center of her palm, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of her pulse. The struggle was over. The war was won and the empire was secure. They were two different worlds that had collided in a storm of rain and silk, and in the end, they had created a new world entirely, one where the gaze from the shadows had finally found its home in the light. The story of the man of iron and the woman of silk didn't end with a farewell. It ended with a permanent burning connection, a realization that while he might own the city of London, she was the only one who truly owned the man who ruled it. Theirs was a love forged in the fire of survival, a resilience that proved that even the most hardened heart could be unraveled by a single humble thread.